Welcome to All Home Care Matters, the show where we discuss all things home care, with discussions on important age-related matters and topics. Brought to you by Enriched Life Home Care Services, the #1 rated home care provider in Michigan by Top Rated Local.
Hello, and welcome back to All Home Care Matters. If this is your first time visiting us here at the show, we want to say thank you for taking time out to be with us today. We appreciate how valuable everyone's time is, and that's why we try and make each episode here at All Home Care Matters something that will hopefully matter to you. Today, we are honored to welcome a remarkable guest, Dr. Edward Smink, the author of The Soul of Caregiving, a caregiver's guide to healing and transformation. Welcome, Dr. Smink.
Well, thank you for having me, Lance. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to reach out and help those caregivers who are experiencing the symptoms of compassion fatigue.
Yes.
I know what it's about because I went through it 30 years ago. And oftentimes you feel there's no hope. It's like a cloud that descends upon you, and you question whether or not you'll ever be the same. I always say, look at me now, and it's proof that you are able to find ways of coping and finding that perfect coach or counselor that could hold you in that tension and help you get well.
So, Dr. Smink, would you like us to call you Dr. Smink, or how would you like us to address you for the interview?
You can call me Edward if you like.
Okay, great. So, Edward, when you first got into the caregiving, this was from personal experience, and then it led you on this journey to writing The Soul of Caregiving, a caregiver's guide to healing and transformation. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your personal caregiving journey?
Well, I began, at 18, I entered a religious order of brothers that took care of the sick. And I was 18 years old, very naive, and I became a what they call today a nursing assistant. And then eventually I developed this interest in spending more time with the patients. I became a registered nurse, and I really enjoyed the interaction with the patients that I was working with. I was also impressed by the different caregivers and how most of them felt it was a real vocation. And I also felt that it was a real vocation to reach out and to support others. Well, about 20 years into that experience, I developed compassion fatigue. And I also was on the brink of burnout. And I didn't know anything about what that was. And I remember I was co-directing a workshop. And during the workshop, I just broke down and I said, I can't do this anymore. And I went to talk to the other directors that I was co-directing. And I said, I have to leave. And they said, you can't leave. You're co-directing this retreat. And I said, I have to go. And I left. And all I remember is I needed to call a person that really saved my life. He sort of said, Edward, I'm here to help you. And I saw him 3 times a week for a couple of months. He said, I want you to learn how to get back into being the person you are. I really didn't know how bad it was. And I asked him, on a scale of 1 to 10, where am I? And he said, well, if I think 10 is the worst, you're between 8 and 9. And I consider 10 irreversible.
Wow.
So compassion fatigue has to deal with something you love. I love caring for people. And I'm saying, well, what was the first time I really had an experience of being a caregiver? Well, it was when I was about 5 or 6, and this puppy was howling outside our back door. And I opened the door, and there he was. He was bleeding. He cut his paw on a piece of glass, and I took him in. And the next thing I know, I went to my parents and I said, "Can we have this dog?" And they said, "Okay." And my sister says that my father and I went to the emergency room. I don't remember that, for the dog, and they let me keep him. And so that was my first experience of being a caregiver. So caregiving and compassion fatigue happens because it's an occupational hazard. Charles Figley says that caregivers suffer vicariously because they care. So all caregivers experience some form of compassion fatigue, which is really exhaustion. Exhaustion in doing the things I love and not listening to those interior promptings, which I call your soul, that's telling you you need rest or you need to find some form of self-care. Now that's totally different from burnout. And burnout has to deal with you're working in an organization or with a group of people that does not accept the human qualities that you have. So you're like climbing up a mountain, like Sisyphus. No matter what you do, it doesn't make a difference. And so you feel that lack of human interaction. And because you have that lack of interaction, what usually happens is that you find yourself not being rewarded. You find yourself not having those supports. And eventually you say, I got to get out of here, as I did, because with the organization I was working with, no matter what I did, it didn't matter.
Okay.
And all of us like some sense of recognition. We like to know that we're being accepted for who we are and what we do.
Value.
And that just didn't happen. So that's the difference between, very simple, the difference between compassion fatigue and burnout. Because I went through that, I felt the real passion. Could I reach out to others? Could I reach out to those that were on the brink of some form of compassion fatigue or burnout and really say to them, it's possible to get well? Because oftentimes you just feel the darkness, the heaviness. It's almost like depression. It's not clinical depression, but it's almost like depression where you just feel, will I ever get out of this? And it takes time. And that's also anti-cultural because we want the quick fix.
Sure. Instant gratification.
Exactly. And so what happens then is that we need to know it's possible to reach out and help and get help from another person. Now that's where I start talking about the cultural taboos that prevent a caregiver from seeking help. I discovered those in my research, and they have to do with our American culture. We're taught at an early age that we can do everything by ourselves. In fact, we think we're invincible, like Superman or Superwoman. But even they had, their Achilles heels.
Sure.
And so we're taught to be invincible, and it comes from the Horatio Alger myth of our American culture. And no matter how hard we try, no matter how hard, we want to be successful, when you're dealing with compassion, fatigue, and burnout, it doesn't work. So that's anti-cultural because the myth says, keep trying harder, keep trying harder. And it has to do with our sense of conquering the new land. Right from the beginning, the difficulty of the new world. And we had to rely on our own instincts, and that's very positive, but we don't do it alone. You can think of a community, and where I worked in Kansas, I just had this sense, because you're in the middle of nowhere, and if a barn burns down, the whole community comes and helps fix it. So even there, you don't do it by yourself, to rebuild your barn. And we could remember that from different films that we had. So I can go through them if you want, if you think it's appropriate at this time.
Sure. Well, I did want to ask a question, and I think you've touched on the caregiver, burnout and compassion fatigue. Can you have one without the other?
Yes. Yes.
So when I'm thinking of compassion fatigue, does that tend to be more with the family caregiver, or the non-professional caregiver, because of the emotion involved?
It could be, yes, and oftentimes what happens is that particular caregiver may develop a sense of being resentful, because the task of caregiving is on them. And so from one perspective, they have this sense, whether they're the spouse or family member, or they're hired to come into the home, they have this sense of, will they allow themselves time to reflect on their experiences? Will they allow themselves time for self-care, which I call soul care, because at the root of who we are, we're our sense of who we are as a person, I say, meets the ground of our being, or meets the sacredness within us, or where we discover God at the source of our being. It's in that place that we can make choices and decisions. So the caregiver may just simply say, if I get some help, I'm going to be okay. Or can I acknowledge within myself that I'm just exhausted?
Right.
And being exhausted and doing the things I love, well, then how can I survive? Or I want to say, how can I maintain or build what's called compassion resilience, that I'm able to separate the different things that I do from what's happening within me. And so I build this resistance. It doesn't mean a wall. It means that we're able to let some of the difficult things just go through us without really affecting us.
Almost like an immunity, almost, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
And I think an important distinction to make is, and I'll let you answer this, what the difference is between a caregiver and a caretaker.
Well, a caregiver, and when you just think of it, a caregiver is one that has a sense of being rooted in their values, has a sense of being fed by their values or fed by their soul. When you're dealing with compassion fatigue or burnout, you lose that connection. And so, but that's what a caregiver is. There's something very human and I want to use mystical or sacred about it. It's integrated. When you talk about a caretaker, well, it's like I'm selling cars. It's like there's a separation between who I am as a person, what I value, and what I do. And oftentimes, you probably have had this experience. You meet a caregiver that's always in top notch, always caring, always compassionate, always there for you. And then you meet someone that you sense, why are they in this profession?
Sure.
They lack that sense of personal interaction. So oftentimes a caregiver can become a caretaker because they're exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, oh, I gotta go take care of my spouse this morning. I have to go to work today. I wish I didn't have to go to work today. And they're sort of at that precipice of exhaustion, and it could lead to burnout when they say, I wish I wish my spouse was dead. I can't take it anymore. And that happens a lot because, again, that particular spouse feels that they have to do it all by themselves.
What, for our viewers and listeners that might be experiencing these exact signs and symptoms that you're speaking about today, what are some ways you recommend that they can help prevent this, or ways to almost make it possible that they avoid? Is it possible for them to avoid the compassion fatigue or the caregiver burnout?
Yes, it is. It is possible. And that's why I talk about the 3 cultural taboos. So let me go through them.
Yes, please.
The first one is, will I trust that something within me needs to be addressed? Most caregivers have a sense that there's something there, but they dismiss it. Oh, I'll just keep going on. I'll just force myself. And so because they don't stop and do and reflect on that sense that, gee, I need to see what this is teaching me, they can develop compassion fatigue or burnout. So the antidote is, will I allow myself to trust what's going on within me, or trust my teammates, or trust my family? Oftentimes the caregiver will say, I don't want to burden my family. I don't want to burden my team. And sometimes they're shamed when they acknowledge, I need help. Again, our culture says you don't need help. You can do it by yourself. So right from the get-go, if you can allow yourself to recognize that we're human, and being human, we're not perfect.
Right.
And I remember giving a class once to new employees, and we had a value of excellence. And I said, does anyone here think they're perfect? And no one raised their hand. And I said, and don't we just hate people who think they are? And the bottom line is that we have a value of excellence because we're always trying to improve. You know, improve doesn't mean you're perfect. Improve means that you're always struggling to find out the best way to deal with a particular situation, and which means that we have this sense of you know, our fallibility. We're not gods.
Right.
You know, we're human. So the second one is, will I trust someone where I can communicate my story? Caregivers need to be heard. They don't want advice. They want to be heard. So who do I trust? Is it my spouse? Is it my pastor or minister? Is it some other clergy person? Is it a counselor? Is it a coach? Who can I trust that I can share my story? Because all of us have normal experiences to traumatic events. So picture the firefighters, the first responders, you know, the police, safety officers, you know, in the situations they're involved in, besides all the different home care makers or those in the health professions. They are often shamed if they say to one of their peers, you know, seeing that person die really affected me.
Right.
Or we just were at this terrible automobile accident and the person died. And who can I share my story with? And the expectation is to just grin and bear it. You know, stuff your feelings. Don't let anyone know how it's affected you. Which leads to the third taboo, which is don't share your emotions. Don't leave your emotions outside the door. Big boys don't cry and big girls are too emotional, and they're both wrong. We, again, have normal reactions to traumatic events. So think of the pandemic that's been going on and how caregivers just had to say, I had enough. They broke the taboo. They went on television. They said, we need more care.
Right.
We're angry, we're depressed, we feel abandoned. Well, those are ways of being able to break the taboo. So can you share your feelings? Now, most of us are taught not to share them. And not only not to share them, not to admit them.
Right.
And so we grow up with this sense of it's dangerous to share your emotions. And a lot of times the emotion might be anger, anger at the situation we're in, or anger that someone isn't there to care for us. And so then how do we allow ourselves to be able to acknowledge that anger is okay? I mean, were you raised growing up that your parents rewarded you when you said you were angry?
Exactly. Right.
See, most of us were taught that anger is something you don't even look at. But there's a justified anger, which has to do with some sense of injustice done to us. And then there's another anger that, can reach and become rage, which is very negative. That's totally separate. But we can be angry because of the situation we're in. And anger sort of propels us to make some choices. So dealing with our emotions is the third. So again, going back to your original question, if we allow ourselves to acknowledge what's going on within ourselves, spend some time to reflect on however we do that, to tell our story so that we're heard. We don't want to be given advice. We just want someone to listen. And so what are the characteristics of a good listener that caregivers can learn, for not only for the clients they care for, but also they can apply them to themselves. Am I listening to what's going on within me? And then the third is that I'm in touch with what I'm feeling.
Right.
I'm in touch with my emotions, or it could be sadness over the death of someone. It could be joy over the birth of someone. It could be, again, an anger at an institution or at a situation that I'm in. I remember this woman coming into the emergency room to see her husband who had just died, and she goes in to see him and beats on his chest and said, why are you doing this to me? That was her honest response. But she at least did that, which sounds, a little crazy, but in that situation it was pretty normal. So those are the three cultural taboos. And if you turn them around, then those are ways of preventing compassion fatigue and burnout.
Why do you think caregivers sometimes aren't willing to communicate their individual stories? Is that because they don't think people care, or they're afraid to open up, or is it a little bit of both?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I know that the main reason is that your teammates think that you're not holding up, like you're almost damaged goods. I remember working with a person that was a first responder, and she was called to this airplane crash, and they couldn't save the pilot. And so they witnessed the person dying, being, burning in the plane that exploded. And she started drinking heavily, and her supervisor said, I think you need a coach. And so as we were getting more and more into what she was feeling, she just said, I felt so hopeless. I couldn't do anything, which normal because they had a protocol. If it's beyond what you can do, like you're putting your life in real danger, you can't do it.
Right.
And so why would you try to go save the pilot when the cockpit is full of flames? And actually it eventually blew up. And so we worked through that. And she then went to their debriefing, but it was voluntarily she went. And her teammates said to her, "Oh, you're going to the Crybabies Club."
Okay.
See, so if you allow yourself to acknowledge what's really going on in our culture, because we have to keep everything together, to be vulnerable is anti-cultural. And most of us are trained not to allow ourselves to go beyond that wall that we build. Now, it's important that we have some sense of boundary. On the other hand, if that wall is so deep that we can't allow ourselves to, recognize what's going on within ourselves, then that's what needs to be looked at. So, I don't know if that particularly answered your question.
No, that does. And so that probably leads into this question, and you may have answered it with what you just said. Is that why it's so dangerous for caregivers to express their emotions and feelings for fear of being excluded or to be labeled and ostracized in some ways?
All of that is true, but the main reason is caregivers are fearful that if they acknowledge that type of vulnerability, they'll be labeled as someone who's mentally ill. See, compassion fatigue and burnout are not mental illnesses. You could be mentally ill and have compassion fatigue and burnout, right, but it's not a mental illness. So what happens is the person is ostracized. Oh, there's that person that can't deal with the job, and oftentimes suffers because of that's what happened to me during the burnout. If I was hit by a Mack truck and had all these cast on, and they would understand. Sure. But they didn't understand what was happening emotionally or psychologically and spiritually, which you can't see.
Right.
And so when I started saying I can't do this, I was ridiculed. I was made fun of. Oh, you're just going crazy. Mm-hmm. Well, I felt I was going crazy until I met Leo, but the bottom line was, you are ostracized. And so caregivers don't want to acknowledge that something is going on. I don't know if you saw this program about 6 months ago on NBC with Lester Holt. He was interviewing a captain of a police department somewhere in Illinois. And the captain said, I have PTSD. And I have it because of the work that we've been involved in. He then brought his whole department together and he said, I don't want to keep this hidden anymore. I want to change the paradigm. Instead of excluding one another when we feel this emotional roller coaster, I want to make it the norm that when we have our departmental meetings, that you can be able to share and debrief from the experiences we have. And so we told them. And so you can see how the paradigm changed, that instead of the team excluding that person, the team became the in counseling terms, it's called the container that holds the crisis. And I use the metaphor of, you're a parent, and when your children oftentimes are hurt or don't understand, they run up to you, and what do? You put out your arms.
Right.
And it's the same thing with creating that container for a caregiver. They put out their arms to hold them. And so that's what we're trained to do, is to hold them in the crisis until they can make the choices, for recovery.
So because you have this segment that, plays such a vital role in the support and well-being of others as a caregiver, they have a lot of things in place to prevent them from being as healthy and almost as productive as possible, for fear of, like you've mentioned, being ostracized and isolated and labeled and singled out. Can you explore some of the strengths of being a caregiver? What are some of the positive strengths?
Well, one of the positive strengths is that you allow yourself to acknowledge that there's something within you that really cares for other people, and you can just I want to say swim in that reality,
Mm-hmm.
which is often lost when you get compassion fatigue. So that resilience is another quality that you have, that you're able to. I mean, I'm visiting a person who's going through rehabilitation at this nursing home, and I'm struck by the kindness and the compassion of the caregivers that are there. It's often overlooked.
Right.
And so, one of the strengths can be to accept compliments. When people say, I'm really grateful for what you're doing, and they may say, oh, it's just my job. Well, that misses the compliment.
Right.
And instead of saying, well, thank you, I really appreciate that. See, that's what feeds them. That's what makes them go into situations that are difficult, because they allow themselves to recognize that particular strength. They love, they're people persons. They love interacting, and often you'll find them saying, I really enjoy the work that I do. And it often becomes very spiritual, and in the sense that there's a real calling to be able to go out and to help people. There's a sense of creating boundaries, that they recognize that, as much as they're involved, that they have to create certain boundaries to protect themselves. And so, it's a real strength that they allow themselves to do that. I think they also have a strength of going where angels dare to tread. That they go into situations. I know myself as a nurse, when I'm talking about some of these experiences with non-medical people, they get very uncomfortable. But if I'm talking with another nurse, then it's just, you're just able to, interact. So that ability to communicate your story, and also, again, to be able to spend those moments to reflect. So the strength is that I'm willing to spend time in enjoying what I do.
Right.
In reflecting on what I do.
When I know a lot of caregivers, professional and family, listen and watch the show, and we're so appreciative and grateful of them. And I'm sure some of them are wondering, what would you say are the signs and symptoms to be cognizant of for compassion fatigue and caregiver burnout? What should people be on the lookout for?
Well, Christine Malchik talks about they can be physical, they can be emotional, and they can be spiritual. So physical has to do with, it could be something as simple as gaining weight or losing weight. It could be a sense of some type of sleeping disorders that happen. It could be something that I'm losing the sense of I really enjoy my work. I'm finding that I'm just focusing on the physical, that there are some physical things that occur. I have more aches and pains. I find myself, exhausted and not willing to ask myself what's going on. So that physical sense. The emotional has to do with, I might find myself being more irritable. I might find myself like being a time bomb. I'm ready to explode. I may even have suicidal ideation because I'm so exhausted from what's going on. I also can find myself not trusting, separating, isolating myself, feeling, I'll just take a deep breath and plow ahead. And I mean, there's times when all of us have to do that, but when we're constantly having to do that, taking those deep breaths and pushing ourselves too much. And I get that sense every once in a while. I'll think of 10 things I want to do, and something happens in me that says, I keep pushing. I go, wait a minute, stop. I'm pushing too hard. I can't do those 10 things.
Right.
So I can do 5, and I could do the other 5 tomorrow. So that sense of racingness, I'm finding myself, I got to do, instead of I want to do. That has helped me. And when I was in burnout, I remember saying to Leo, after about a month, I'm saying, I really, I want to know what's going on. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I want to know where I am. And I think I mentioned that earlier, and he said I was between 8 and 9. But I said, I want to do what the Holy Spirit wants me to do.
Mm-hmm.
He started laughing. And he looked at me right in the eye and he said, the Holy Spirit wants you to do what's the easiest thing. I've used that for the past 30 years and it works. So if I feel overwhelmed, can I allow myself to pause and say, what is the easiest thing to do? And for example, yesterday I was working on a project and I was pushing myself, and then I said, okay, what can wait till tomorrow? Because I was starting to get anxious and overwhelmed.
Sure.
And I said, this can wait till tomorrow. So again, there's that sense of, it might be, I have to take a 10-minute cat nap.
Mm-hmm.
It might be something as simple as, well, I'm going to take that hot shower or hot bath. I mean, something that helps me just pause and say, well, I need to take that nap. And so afterwards, then I can be refreshed.
Sure. And I think that's important. And that leads to this question. Caregivers and people in the health industry often use the word self-care or the phrase self-care, but yet you've coined it soul care. Why did you change it?
I changed it, and I talk about soul in my book, and I think I'm going to talk about it more in the next episode.
Yes.
But I find soul is the animating principle that guides you. We could call it conscience. We can be in touch with our higher power, or God, whatever our spiritual tradition is. But soul encompasses the whole person. James Hillman says, when you know, psychology is the religion of psychotherapists. He says, but when you say soul, you go deeper. You go deeper into that place where I sense you meet the sacred.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere within us is at the center of our being is where we meet the sacred, or meet God. So the human and the divine are sort of brought together. They're not separated. And so soul to me is, we can talk about soul music, we can talk about soul food, we can talk about soul mate. There's something different that leads you to a deeper reality. And so I have the senses when caregivers rediscover that place, that's when you begin to heal, because you're then able to make appropriate choices that can lead you to, transformation and healing, because you have that sense that of connectedness that helps you in your recovery.
Okay. And you talk also about the compassion resilience, and that's through the 3 steps of Dr. Eric Grundy. What exactly is compassion resilience, and what are his 3 steps?
Compassion resilience is the ability to deal with a situation that can be traumatic, and you acknowledge what's happened, what's going on. At the same time, it doesn't make you paralyzed.
Mm-hmm.
So an example I have was, I sat in a patient care conference of this mother and her 30-year-old daughter who had a brain hemorrhage. And she was very concerned. So the doctor, the neurologist, she said that there are 2 ways of dealing with this. One is letting the bleed just heal, and the other is to operate. And so anyway, she said she wanted to operate. So I helped her and the neurosurgeon to have the person transferred. She comes back about a week later into our rehab unit, and I went around to visit, and the mother said, "Do you remember me?" And I, immediately, I don't remember until they tell the story. Mm-hmm. And then I remembered her, and I said, "Yeah, I remember. I was with you during that conference." And then she went on this rampage about how she disliked the neurosurgeon. And I said, well, I was there, and naive me, I'm pouring kerosene on the fire. Okay. And so she became very vitriolic, and she just spewed out her anger. And I knew that the anger wasn't about me. The anger was about the situation. So I remember leaving and walking out of the room and going outside and going up the stairs to the hospital, going up the elevator to the 5th floor. And I'm met by my friend, the social worker. And she said, "Ed, what happened to you? You look terrible." And I said, "Don't say a word. I have to scrape all this murder off of me." Mm. So again, using that sense of, it wasn't about me. So I didn't take it personally, but I had to allow myself to scrape it off. And in doing that's an example of resilience, that I was in it, it affected me, but I was able to put it in its proper place. When you have compassion fatigue and burnout, though, that wall gets very porous. And so you can't separate it, you can't pull it. So he says the first step is, and I talked a little bit about that, is to recognize and admit there's something that needs to be done.
Yeah.
And then he then says, when you acknowledge that, and that's where I got this tied into Taboos with his work, that you can trust someone to be heard. He mentions the word heard. And so I don't know if you've had an experience of telling a story and all of a sudden you just feel they understand. And as soon as you have that sense of being heard and they understand, it sort of frees you, then that you're then able to go into the third step, which is make choices of self-care that pertain to you. Because self-care can be different for all different people.
Right.
So those are the three steps. You acknowledge again that you need some help. You're able to communicate that and able to share that story, and so that you're heard. And once you're heard, you say, okay, I now know what I can do, but I can't do that unless I'm heard.
And this is why this is part one of our 3-part series with Dr. Edward Smink. In this episode, we're calling this, or Dr. Smink more accurately calls it, the dance of the caregiver. And that's because you have all of these different steps and different ways of handling obstacles and situations that caregivers face day in and day out. We experience that personally with our caregivers, and with your professional experience and expertise, you're trying to give them the tips and the tools to combat some of these cultural taboos and compassion fatigue and the caregiver burnout that so many of them are faced with, and some of them suffer with silently.
They do suffer silently, again, because of the cultural taboos that prevent them, from expressing what they need to do. And the dance really is between, caregivers are drawn, to care for others. So there's a dance to care for others. And then there is that sense of, well, what about caring for myself?
Right.
And so that's the tension that goes, it's almost like two-step. That's the tension that goes on, and allowing ourselves to acknowledge there is a tension is really, again, the first step.
Right. Well, Dr. Smink, Edward, I want to thank you. And like we've mentioned, this is part one. And part two, we will be discussing the importance of being heard and who will listen to their story. So we hope our viewers and listeners will stay tuned for part two. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Lance. It's been a great opportunity.
It's been our pleasure. Bye-bye. Thank you for joining us today here at All Home Care Matters. All Home Care Matters is here to help families as they navigate these long-term care issues. We invite you to visit us at allhomecarematters.com, where there's a private, secure, fillable form where you can give us show ideas, ask questions. Every form is read and responded to. And remember, you can listen to the show on any of your favorite podcast streaming platforms or watch the show on our official YouTube channel. Just make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. We'd also like to thank Dr. Edward Smink for joining us today here on All Home Care Matters. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us again on another episode of All Home Care Matters. To learn more about the show and to connect with us, visit us at allhomecarematters.com.